Science and Technology Policy. And we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of these talks. So we're really excited about this, and we have a great program for you today, which is nuclear power and energy insecurity in the Middle East. For those of you who follow Washington scandals, you might have read the House Oversight Committee report, which was all about U.S. plans for nuclear energy with Saudi Arabia. That's not the topic of this talk today, but we can certainly get to it in the discussion session. Instead, we have Dr. Ali Ahmed, who is here with us today, who directs the Energy Policy and Security Program at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. I'm really excited. I don't know how often you get to Washington, but he was here for some other meetings. Ali focuses on nuclear security, energy policy, and economics. He is a physicist by training and has his PhD from Cambridge University. And some of you here may know him from some of the work he did while he was at Princeton University, program on science and global security. So Ali will give his presentation, and then we'll sit down and we'll have a discussion, and hopefully with lively participation from all of you. So thank you. Let's welcome
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you everyone for attending. It's great to be here. I'm grateful for this opportunity offered to me by the International Science and Technology Policy Program here at the university. So, yes, my background or my work right now focuses on examining the role of nuclear energy in the Middle East. And we look at it from several perspectives, from economics, security, but more recently from energy security perspectives as well. I remember 5 years ago when I started looking at these questions, I just joined Princeton and I was asked to go to the Middle East and interview all the governments there and the promoting agencies to ask them about their plans for nuclear power. And my first question to them was, logically, why are you interested in nuclear power? And immediately, and almost everyone I asked, the immediate answer was, we're interested in nuclear because it improves our energy security. At the time, I did not think too much of their answer because I was focusing on other issues I want to get over with. But recently, I had the chance to reflect more on these interviews and meetings and to dig deeper into this dynamics and connections between energy security and the deployment of nuclear power in the Middle East region. So my talk today is in that context. Okay. How can I scroll down? Yeah, I need some help. Sorry.
Is that a clicker?
Can you see it? Okay, thank you.
Sorry, there's a thing
Yeah,
across
yeah,
the top.
I can, wait, I can do, yeah. So currently in the region, we have 6 countries that are seriously considering nuclear power. However, we have different levels of commitments towards nuclear power. We have countries that already have operating nuclear reactors, such as Iran. The Bushehr reactor in Iran has been operating since 2013. It produces about 1,000 megawatt of power. We have the United Arab Emirates currently finalizing the construction of 4 reactors. They will be online soon and connected to the grid. So these 2 countries are the most advanced in terms of nuclear power deployment. We have a second or another level of commitment which is countries that are in the early stages or pre-construction stages of nuclear power. They have serious commitment and they have finalized government agreements. And these countries are Turkey and Egypt. Both of those countries have their agreements with Rosatom, the Russian-owned nuclear company. And we have a third category of countries that have serious commitments towards nuclear power, but yet nothing has been established. And this category includes Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Okay. Here. Perfect. So in terms of capacity, also capacity can be divided into three categories. So we have the current capacity, operational capacity, which, as I said, only Iran Bushehr reactor has this capacity because it's the only operational reactor. Second type of capacity is committed capacity. So these are contracted capacity. So these countries have already signed contracts to build this capacity. And we have, as you can see, UAE, Turkey, and Egypt. And we have a third category of capacity, which is planned capacity. So this is our nuclear power plants these countries want to build, but there is no finalized and signed contracts yet. So in this regard, we have Saudi Arabia, and as Sharon mentioned, Saudi Arabia's nuclear program currently is under scrutiny. So initially in 2012, the Saudis wanted to establish or to build 16 nuclear reactors. When they established the King Abdullah City for Atomic and Renewable Energy. And it was part of a much bigger plan to diversify the country's energy mix. Recently, this plan has been shelved, and now the Saudis are only talking about 2 reactors, but also some interest in small modular reactors as well. Jordanians started thinking about nuclear since 2008, along with other countries. And since then, they have engaged primarily with the Russians, and they have signed multiple agreements with the Russians, but nothing has been achieved. And recently, this agreement was canceled, and the primary reason that was given for it is financing. Initial agreement that Russia and Jordan will split the financing 50-50, but even the 50% the Jordanians, which is equivalent to $5 billion for one reactor, for 2 unit reactors or power plants. Even those $5 billion, the Jordanians had difficulty in raising funding for it. And the Russians clearly, for them, during my interviews with Rosatom and the Russian analysts, they always place Jordan at the bottom of their priority. So they prioritize the more strategic countries such as Egypt and Turkey in terms of displacement of funding. Jordan right now has an interest in small modular reactors, which actually fits better their electricity grid because apart from financing, and this is something we have highlighted since 2014, is that the Jordanian power grid is very small. It's 3.6 gigawatt. And if you want to build one reactor, 1 gigawatt, then you are adding almost a third of your capacity in one site. And this creates a lot of problems technically and security as well. But now there's a revived interest in small reactors. And if you ask why small reactors, they say, oh, because it fits our grid better. It's a small capacity. Right. So going back to the rationale or motivations for nuclear power in the Middle East region, we can split those motivations into 2 categories as well. The first category is the official statements you get from governments and officials. And those, as I mentioned, energy security is a primary reason why these countries consider nuclear power, at least in their official statements. And energy security, by that, they also mean diversification, because as you know, in the region we have heavy dependence on oil and gas. I mean, now oil and gas, but before it was oil. And one way to diversify is to add nuclear. But in oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, there is also an argument about oil substitution. And this argument is valid when oil prices are high. Then there's an opportunity cost if you burn this oil domestically. So if you can satisfy your power demand domestically by other sources and export this oil on the international market, then you are better off economically. And this is a valid argument. But again, like the challenge with this argument is, can you, for the lifetime of nuclear reactor, which is 60 years, can you guarantee a price range or a price environment that will keep you in this profitable margin? And we all know with how energy markets now are being shifted and being transformed, the future of oil is really questionable, pricing-wise. But also there's a third motivation for those countries, which is to build a highly skilled base of engineers, and nuclear power is looked at as a domain that can offer these highly skilled opportunities. Now, it would be too naive for us or anyone to look at nuclear power motivations in the Middle East and not consider the unofficial rationale. So the things that these governments don't tell you or don't tell us directly. There is a huge prestige factor. Having nuclear power plants is perceived that you are joining a club of nuclear power producing country, and this by itself is perceived as highly prestigious. There are also historical and institutional pressure that comes from within these countries to establish nuclear programs, and this is particularly relevant to Iran and Egypt, because Iran and Egypt, their nuclear program started in the 50s. Iran's ironically with the help of the United States under the Atoms for Peace program. And so you can imagine, since the 50s, they have generations and generations of nuclear engineers and institutions that they have every interest in maintaining these programs. And if you can imagine that these programs will be shut down, then you have a large group of establishments that would be affected. So those establishments and individuals, they have every interest in promoting nuclear power to basically to keep their jobs. But also, and more importantly, there is a geopolitical rebalancing effect that we currently see between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and this is also plays a lot in the nuclear, particularly from the Saudi side. So the nuclear program of Saudi Arabia is largely connected to Iran's nuclear program, and what supports such a statement is why Saudi Arabia has not started the nuclear program 10 years ago. Why now, although they have a lot of plans, why they are not starting to materialize those plans? So there's a waiting, but waiting of what? No one knows. And also the Saudis, they have not hidden that they have interest in matching Iran's capability, being it peaceful or non-peaceful. So this is also no longer a secret. Now going to, or looking at the other side of this talk, which is the concept of energy security. And when you look at energy security, you realize it's such a malleable term, and it's really something very, very hard to define. I think one of the leading experts in energy security, Benjamin Sokol, published a paper a few years ago, and he defined 143 metrics of measuring energy security. So you can imagine the complexity of what determines energy security. Ultimately, energy security, it's about who you ask. So energy security to governments is different than energy security to civil society, is different than energy security to corporations. Even within the same government establishments, different institutions might perceive energy security differently. So it's very, very hard to pinpoint exactly an exact definition of or concept of energy security. However, as a concept, perhaps it was coined following the Arab oil embargo in the early 70s, and it was largely connected with ensuring that no future disruption of oil or fuel will happen. And this has triggered a lot of policies over the year here in the US, but also in other countries to prevent such disruptions. And for example, one of the outcomes of such policies is France investments in nuclear. And now, as a result of that, in France, for example, we have 65% of their electricity is generated by nuclear. I think nowadays it would be fair to say that it is inappropriate to summarize or to just say energy security is just to ensure access to oil and other fuel. Energy now is a much more complex system of parts that for anyone to be energy secure, you have to have mastery in all these parts and components. One thing about energy security that's very interesting happening these days is that it serves, I think this is an observation that's happening in the Middle East, and I will highlight later, is that the main beneficiary of energy security historically has been perceived to be the public. So governments normally perceive energy security policies, again, whatever that means, in the interest of the public. But what we are seeing right now is that we are seeing corporates, oil and gas companies, renewable companies, nuclear companies for that matter, also using the argument of energy security to promote their product. So there's a shift of whose energy security becomes a concern to who. I mean, now there are two trends happening in the energy sector. The first trend is digitalization. The second trend is decentralization. And this, by definition, removes this concern from the consumer perspective and puts it more on the supplier and producer perspective. So for me, I wanted to really understand the use of energy security in the public discourse in the Middle East. So one exercise I did is that I looked at the 6 countries and I chose from each country 2 newspapers, one in Arabic or Persian in the case of Iran, Farsi, and I used simple Google archiving and counting mechanism to count in these articles, how many articles that contain certain phrases together. So for example, nuclear energy security alongside nuclear, alongside other things. So, and I just plotted the number of these articles since 2008 up to 2018. And the reason why I went back only to 2008, because 2008 was the time when all these plans in the Middle East started to take form. And you see here on this chart the number of articles, and interesting the correlation between that the 3 countries that have the highest number of articles that has energy security and nuclear in the same article are the countries with the most advanced nuclear programs. So these countries have done fairly decent job in communicating to their people why they are building a nuclear power. And you can see like they were serious from the beginning, that they felt they had to communicate this idea. And and the other 3 countries, you can see really not much. If this is, we are talking about 10 years from 2008 to 2018. In Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt, there isn't much of communication from the government to the people. By the way, I forgot to mention that these 2 newspapers I picked are either governmental or semi-governmental. So they represent what the government wants to show. So clearly counting articles is easy, so somebody has to look at the content of these articles. And as you can see, there are not many. I mean, you could do that. And so by looking at those articles in all the countries, there are 3 misperceptions that I have identified. The first misperception is that having a nuclear power promotes energy security, and this ultimately will benefit the nation and the public. So this is the first misperception. And I say it's a misperception because of what I mentioned earlier about this shift of concern from consumers to producers. I think Sharon and I were in Moscow a few months ago, and a gentleman from Rosatom mentioned that Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear company, employs 200,000 people and brings to the Russian economy tens of billions of dollars of revenue per year. And clearly, the Russian industry in Russia is stagnating. I mean, how many nuclear reactors can you build? So clearly, they have to think of external markets. So for them, they have every interest of exporting their nuclear industry to other countries. Of course, there are some arguments about the strategic decision of such steps, but commercially as well, for them to keep all these jobs alive, they have to find clients for their nuclear industry. So to what extent vendors are benefiting from these plans is almost absent from these articles. There is no mention that other people will benefit. It's one direction, only us will benefit from having nuclear power. The second misperception I identified is mixing energy security with energy independence. And these are completely different things. And if achieving or working towards energy security is remotely achievable, energy independence is almost impossible. So even the most advanced countries cannot be energy independent. And you look, when you think of this context, you think of Japan in 2011, such an advanced country. Overnight, they lost 20% of their electricity, and then for the next 8 years, they had to rely on expensive liquefied natural gas. So energy independence, if energy security does not make sense, energy independence does not even come close. The third misconception is there is always an emphasis in those articles about we are going to use nuclear energy to build highly skilled workforce. We will have, you will see these engineers who are going to work on these nuclear power plants. And there is an exaggeration not only in the quality of jobs, but also the number of jobs. Clearly, any infrastructure project will create temporarily large number of jobs because of the construction and other things. But on the long term, there's also some inflation of expectations of how much nuclear power, how much jobs nuclear power can actually produce. Now, what's interesting, because I still meet with those people, I still interview them, and since 2014, if you ask them now about localization, they say, no, we are not thinking about localization anymore. So I think they have come to the realization that everyone realizes that this is not serious. You cannot, countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, they don't have human capacity to localize. I mean, they could localize, Saudi Arabia has a respectful industry. They have an excellent petrochemical industry. So in other parts, there might be some overlap, but in terms of like the sensitive technologies, nuclear power, they don't have the human capacity. So when we talk about energy security now, we talk about multiple things, but the one major aspect is cost. So energy security now, according to its modern definition, it has this affordability element. So can we access affordable sources of energy? And when you talk about nuclear, you don't talk about nuclear in a vacuum. You talk about nuclear in comparison to something else, to other alternative energy sources. So this chart shows the cost difference between nuclear and the alternatives, renewable alternatives, solar PV and utility scale solar PV and utility scale wind between 2009 and 2017. And you can see that indeed in 2009 nuclear was much more cost competitive than renewables because solar PV costs were very high. Not compared to wind, but solar, which is the main resource in the region, the main renewable resource in the region. But what's interesting is that we knew in 2009 that costs of solar would go down. We knew that this is happening, this is going to happen. And indeed, that's what happened. So over the years, the cost of solar went down. So this cost difference reached the break-even point in 2013. So in 2013, the economic competitiveness or cost competitiveness between nuclear and unsubsidized solar reached zero. And since then, solar is much more economically competitive than nuclear. This is important because I see a similar trend repeating itself with storage. So now storage is expensive, but we know that storage is going to get cheaper. And storage actually feeds into the discussion more because when coupled with solar or any intermittent energies, it makes this energy source more dispatchable, more flexible in using it to meet the demand. So now, again, like in a conference we hosted in Beirut, the main critique I got is that about storage is it's too expensive. And I said, I know it's too expensive, but it's just a matter of time before storage becomes economically competitive. So the same trend will repeat as well with storage, I think. So let's take a specific case study about the United Arab Emirates. So the United Arab Emirates started their nuclear program in 2008. It took them 4 years to do all the financial planning, legal planning on all these indirect investments. They started construction in 2013. And at that time, what you see here on the chart is the red is the cost of solar CSP, which is solar thermal. And the gray histograms are the solar PV. And you can see the cost in 2013 that solar PV and nuclear were almost the same. But solar CSP was much more expensive. And solar CSP is important because it involves storage, thermal storage. So it can be more dispatchable than solar, so less intermittent than solar PV. And fast forward to 2017, and you can see that even solar CSP, which is dispatchable and therefore can be used as baseload, this is the argument for nuclear power that is often used. We see now in 2017 that the cost of solar CSP and the nuclear is almost the same. And again, if you project a few years into the future, solar CSP will become cheaper. Solar PV is definitely cheaper. We're not talking about solar PV here. I mean, as I said, with solar PV, the break-even point was achieved in 2013. So again, when we look at other alternatives, we have the gas, natural gas. So why natural gas is also interesting to consider because it's cheap, and there are no signals or market signals that natural gas sustainably will be expensive in the future. From one hand, we see increased production. For example, I come from a country, Lebanon. We never dreamed that we'll be like a gas-producing country, but now we will be soon because there are some discoveries in the East Med, in the offshore East Med. So even countries like Lebanon could be oil gas-producing countries. So that we have increased projections of gas oversupply in the future. On the other hand, we see slowing down the Chinese economy, which was the main consumer of natural gas. We see also trend of removing the pricing of gas, making it less dependent on oil pricing. This will bring also the costs down. So all these elements give us some level of confidence that on the long term, natural gas prices will not be too high, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. So when you do the comparison between natural gas and nuclear, there are two different comparisons because nuclear is capital intensive. So all your expenditure, all your money is put upfront in the capital. While for gas, the main cost component is the fuel component. So here what you can do is you can think of a crossover point. What is the price of natural gas below which natural gas will be more favorable to nuclear? And if gas price go upper than this threshold, then nuclear would become more economic. And clearly, because the nuclear is capital intensive, this depends on many variables. It depends on how much capital you want to invest, and it depends on the discount rate of the country. And for example, in countries in the Middle East, you can think of two types of countries. Countries with economically favorable conditions. They have AAA credit ratings, such as UAE or Saudi Arabia. And you can assume that for those countries, they have lower investment costs because they have good credit rating. And the other The other group is countries that have economical difficulties. So, based on that, you can come up with a crossover price for natural gas. So let's take the most favorable case, which is the low discount rate for countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and you can see that for large reactor, the crossover point is around $9.6, $10 per million BTU. So if gas prices, if these countries can export their natural gas be higher than this price, then nuclear could make sense economically for them. When you look at small modular reactors, this crossover threshold actually is pushed to around $12 per million BTU, because with small reactors you lose the economies of scale. So your levelized cost is higher. And so the question is, to summarize, can the Saudis and the Emiratis guarantee that their natural gas can be exported at these prices or higher for 60 years? This is the question they should answer. For the other countries, I mean, you can see for countries like Jordan, for example, if they want to build small reactors, the difference between natural gas and nuclear is massive. So, other things that are not stated, governments don't share with their public, but also with us in academia and the think tank world about their nuclear plants, is the vendor-client dynamics. So importing a nuclear power plant is not like importing car factories. So nuclear is a very sensitive industry that brings in a lot of international and bilateral commitments, and it's really a special relationship. So when a country imports nuclear power from another country, these two countries is a statement that these two countries have very strong special relationship, and this relationship is guaranteed to continue to be strong for the lifetime of the reactor. The challenge with this is, we know that politics is fluid, and political alliances can shift with time, and such a thing like building a nuclear power plant can be used as a political leverage, and this is something particularly special to countries that depend heavily on these power plants. Think of Jordan and their small grid, and if they build a Russian reactor, what would happen? Another thing is that energy has been used before as a weapon, and I don't want to pinpoint Russia. I mean, all countries do it, but the most visible examples are the Russian examples. So Russia has given many winter ultimatums to countries in Eastern Europe about natural gas. One of the issues with Iran nuclear program and Iran's insistence on enrichment is Russia's refusal at some point to deliver the fuel to Iran. So Russia has used energy as a weapon before, and also a couple of years ago, the grid of the Ukraine, the grid was hijacked, and the whole Ukrainian grid was shut down. So it's not unthinkable that energy can be used for political reasons. So looking at things from a security perspective, because I think this is equally important, if not more important than the economic perspective, because after all, economics, if you think about economics as the main reason in the Middle East, then good luck, because economics is not really important at all. But security is important. And here in the Middle East, we have a history of nuclear proliferation. I mean, first of all, in the 60s, we have Israel acquiring nuclear weapons. In the 70s and 80s, Iraq developed suspicious nuclear activities that led Israel to actually bomb one of the Iraqi research reactors that was suspected of being capable of producing plutonium. We know now that Gaddafi in Libya had connections with the Gaddafi regime, had connections with AQ Khan, and who leaked design of centrifuges to the Libyan regime. We know that Iran in early 2000, they did not declare sensitive nuclear facilities to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so on. So we have, nuclear in the Middle East. We had some historical events that can tell us that nuclear activities can be linked to the politics of the region. Now, when you look at the current status, this is actually make us worry, because what we see right now, we see a deepening sectarian divide that is resulting in proxy wars in Yemen, in Iraq, a political proxy war in Lebanon that can evolve. So this is not a healthy environment to build tens of nuclear power plants. And I think if you add to that, Iran's capability to resume its enrichment is a worrying sign as well. I mean, luckily the JCPOA was instrumental in freezing the Iran's nuclear program. I'm not sure how long the agreement will survive, but in the case that the standoff between the US and Iran continues, Iran has the capability of resuming its enrichment capacity rather quickly. And the same breakout dilemma that we had before the deal will be also on the table. And then when you consider the Saudi response, things become also more complicated, especially that they have declared that they're interested in replicating whatever Iran is interested in or doing. And now, as Sharon mentioned, one of the talking points of the town is the Saudis' insistence on not signing the 123 agreement, which stipulates if Saudi Arabia wants to have American technology, that they should forego enrichment and reprocessing. And more importantly, they are refusing also to sign the additional protocol that gives the IAEA more leverage and power and to inspect Saudi facilities. So these are all worrying signs about nuclear power, deployment of nuclear power in the region. But one can still assume that nations and states might still have some rationality. But what the groups that don't have rationality are the terrorist groups. And this is, I think, a more serious threat, security threat, when it comes to deployment of nuclear power. So what you see on the screen was taken last year. So the Houthis in Yemen, who are fighting a war with the alliance of the Saudi and Emirati forces, and the Houthis are supported by Iran. So they claim that they fired a missile on the Al Baraka nuclear power plant in Abu Dhabi. I think chances are that this is wrong. This is not a true event, but for me, this is not the worry, that if this was true or not. The worry is that those groups, they thought of Al Baraka as a target. The very fact that they thought of this nuclear power plant as a potential target, this is super worrying. And I think once they have access to better missile technologies and more sophisticated missile technologies, then this maybe will be reality, unfortunately. So what I would like to conclude with is the following. I believe that the role of nuclear power in promoting energy security from both economic and security perspective in the Middle East is at least questionable. If you look at all deployment scenarios, be it small modular reactors or large reactors, unfortunately, those have serious economic weaknesses and security vulnerabilities. Thank you.